He thought she was a nobody. He thought she was just a poor, quiet girl he had rescued from a life of poverty. Richard Sterling, a top Manhattan executive, walked into that courtroom with a smirk, his designer suit, and his mistress giggling in the back row. He was ready to destroy his wife, Sandra, to leave her with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. But Richard made one fatal calculation. He didn't check her background. He didn't know that the woman he was calling a leech wasn't poor at all. In fact, she owned the very ground he was standing on. When the courtroom doors opened and the royal guard walked in, Richard's smirk didn't just fade, it shattered. This is the story of the most brutal divorce court karma in history. You are not going to believe how this ends. The heavy oak doors of the Manhattan Supreme Court swung open with a groan that seemed to echo the misery of every soul inside. It was October 14th, a rainy Tuesday, that turned the New York skyline into a blur of charcoal and steel. But inside courtroom 304, the atmosphere was electric, though entirely one-sided. Richard Sterling walked in like he owned the building. At 42, Richard was the picture of modern American success. He was the senior VP of Sterling and Finch, a private equity firm that specialized in hostile takeovers. He had the jawline of a movie star, the cold blue eyes of a shark, and a bespoke Brioni suit that cost more than most people's cars. He checked his Rolex, a platinum Daytona, and smirked. Today was the day. Today he would finally cut the dead weight loose. That dead weight in his mind was his wife of 6 years, Sandra. Sitting at the plaintiff's table, Richard leaned over to his lawyer, Marcus Stone. Stone was known in the city as the Butcher. He didn't just win divorces, he annihilated the opposition. "Is she here yet?" Richard whispered, tapping his fountain pen against the mahogany table. "She's outside," Stone replied, his voice a gravelly purr. "She's trying to get her public defender to understand the paperwork. It's pathetic, really. Richard, this is going to be a slaughter. We have the hiding of assets perfectly structured. She'll be lucky if she walks away with a bus ticket." Richard chuckled darkly. "Good. She brought nothing into this marriage, and she's taking nothing out. I want her back in that studio apartment in Queens where I found her. She's boring, Marcus. She's plain. She has zero ambition. I need a woman who matches my stature." He glanced toward the back of the courtroom. There, sitting in the second row, pretending to look solemn, but failing miserably, was Jessica Vane. Jessica was 24, a struggling lifestyle influencer, with blonde extensions lips that had seen the best surgeons in Miami, and a hunger for Richard's credit card that was insatiable. She caught Richard's eye and gave a tiny, flirty wave, blowing a discreet kiss. She was wearing a tight black dress that was entirely inappropriate for court, but Richard loved it. She was the trophy he felt he deserved. "Order all rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Anthony Calvetti walked in. He was a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for hating time-wasters. He took his seat and adjusted his glasses. "Docket number 4492, Sterling versus Sterling. Counsel, state your appearances." "Marcus Stone for the plaintiff. Richard Sterling, Your Honor." Stone boomed, exuding confidence. "Arthur Pendleton for the defendant. Mrs. Sandra Sterling." A soft, shaky voice came from the other side. Richard rolled his eyes. Sandra had walked in. She looked exactly as Richard described her to his friends, Mousy. She was wearing a grey wool cardigan that was 2 sizes too big, a plain black skirt and sensible flat shoes. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy loose bun, and she wore zero makeup. She kept her head down, clutching a battered leather satchel. To the outside world, she looked like a woman defeated before the fight had even begun. She looked like a woman who had been crushed by the weight of her husband's success. Arthur Pendleton. Her lawyer didn't inspire much confidence either. He was an elderly man, perhaps 70, with a rumpled suit and a briefcase that looked like it had survived a war. He fumbled with his papers, dropping a pen as he stood up. Richard snickered audibly. Jessica giggled in the back. "Mr. Stone, proceed," Judge Calvetti said, looking bored already. "Your Honor." Stone began pacing the floor. "We are here to demonstrate that this marriage is irretrievably broken due to the defendant's complete lack of contribution. My client, Mr. Sterling, is a titan of industry. He has built an empire. Mrs. Sterling, on the other hand, has not worked a day in the last 6 years. She sits at home. She contributes nothing to the household finances. And now she has the audacity to demand alimony." Stone paused for dramatic effect, pointing an accusatory finger at Sandra, who was staring at her hands. "We have evidence, Your Honor, that Mrs. Sterling is merely a gold digger who trapped my client into marriage. We are filing for a complete dissolution of assets with 0 spousal support. We are offering a one-time settlement of $10,000 to help her relocate. Given that she came into the marriage with debt, we find this generous." A ripple of shock went through the few observers in the court. Richard Sterling was worth an estimated $50 million. Offering his wife $10,000 was a slap in the face so hard it left a mark. Sandra didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She just adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Pendleton," the judge asked, "does your client wish to respond to this offer?" The old lawyer. Arthur stood up slowly. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice was oddly calm. "Your Honor, my client rejects the offer. We are not asking for half of Mr. Sterling's assets." Richard leaned back, whispering to Stone. "See, she knows she can't win. She's going to fold. However," Arthur continued, "we are asking for a full audit of Mr. Sterling's offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, specifically the shell company, Jupiter Holdings, which he used to purchase the penthouse on 5th Avenue for his associate Ms. Jessica Vane." The room went deadly silent. Richard's face turned a shade of pale violet. He shot a look at Jessica, whose jaw had dropped. How did they know about Jupiter Holdings? That account was buried under 3 layers of corporate anonymity. "Objection," Stone roared. "Relevance and purely speculative." "Overruled," Judge Calvetti said. Leaning forward, his interest suddenly piqued. "If marital assets were used to buy property for a third party, that is very relevant. Proceed, Mr. Pendleton." Richard clenched his fists under the table. He looked at Sandra. She wasn't looking at the floor anymore. She had lifted her head. For a split second, Richard saw something in her eyes he had never seen before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sadness. It was cold, hard steel. But just as quickly, she looked down again, returning to the role of the meek housewife. Richard shook his head. "It's a fluke," he thought. "She just got lucky and found a receipt. I will crush her." "The gloves are off," Richard hissed to his lawyer. "Destroy her, Marcus. Bring up her family." The courtroom recess was called for lunch, and the tension in the hallway was thick enough to choke on. Richard Sterling stood near the vending machines, aggressively typing on his BlackBerry liquidating assets and moving funds before the court could freeze them. "Richard, baby," Jessica whined, hanging onto his arm. "Why did that old man say my name?" "You said my name wouldn't come up. This is bad for my brand. I have a sponsorship deal with a tea detox company. I can't be seen as a home wrecker in court records." Richard shook her off roughly. "Shut up, Jessica. It's a standard tactic. They're bluffing. They want a settlement. They want me to panic and write a check for $1 million just to make them go away. Well, I'm not doing it." He looked down the hallway. Sandra was sitting on a wooden bench eating a sandwich she had brought from home in a plastic bag. She looked pathetic. Richard walked over to her, his expensive shoes clicking on the linoleum. He towered over her. "Sandra," he said, his voice dripping with fake pity. She looked up, chewing slowly. "Richard, look at you," he sneered. "Eating a bologna sandwich in a courthouse. Is this really how you want to go out? You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing me." "I'm just eating lunch, Richard," she said softly. "Take the 10 grand, he hissed, leaning closer so no one else could hear. "Take the 10 grand and disappear. Because if we go back in there, Marcus is going to bring up your past. We're going to talk about how I found you working as a waitress in that dive bar in Brooklyn. We're going to talk about how you have no family, no degree, no pedigree. You are a nobody, Sandra. I made you, and I can break you." Sandra stopped chewing. She carefully wrapped the remainder of her sandwich in the plastic wrap and placed it in her bag. She stood up. Even in her flat shoes, she held herself with a posture that was surprisingly regal. "You didn't find me in a dive bar, Richard," she said, her voice calm and measured. "You found me in a jazz club. I wasn't a waitress. I was helping the owner who was a friend." "Same thing." Richard waved his hand dismissively. "You were poor. You had holes in your shoes." "I liked those shoes," she said simply. "Richard, I'm going to give you one chance. Stop this. Stop the lies. Admit to the infidelity, agree to a fair split of the assets acquired during the marriage, and let's end this quietly. I don't want your millions. I just want what is fair." "Fair?" Richard laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Fair is what I say it is. You want a war, you got one. I'm going to make sure you can't even get a job cleaning toilets in this city when I'm done with you." He turned on his heel and stormed back to Jessica, who was busy checking her makeup in her phone camera. "What did she say?" Jessica asked. "She tried to beg." Richard lied. "She knows she's finished." Back inside the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. Judge Calvetti looked annoyed. The discovery of the hidden apartment for the mistress had irritated him. He didn't like liars. "Mr. Stone, you may continue your opening arguments," the judge said. Marcus Stone stood up, buttoning his jacket. He gave Sandra a predatory smile. "Your Honor, to understand why the plaintiff deserves nothing, we must look at her character. She claims to be a supportive wife. Yet for 6 years, she has refused to attend company galas. She refuses to travel with Mr. Sterling to important business meetings in Paris and Milan. She isolates him. She is antisocial and unrefined." Stone picked up a document. "Furthermore, we have run a background check on Mrs. Sterling, or should I say, Sandra Doe. It seems Mrs. Sterling has no birth certificate in the United States. She claims to be from a small town in Europe, yet there are no records of her graduating from the university she claimed to attend. She is a fraud, Your Honor. A drifter who latched onto a wealthy American man." Sandra's lawyer, Arthur, didn't object. He just sat there, polishing his glasses with a handkerchief. "She is a woman of no history," Stone continued, his voice rising. "A woman of no standing. She brings nothing to the table but deceit. My client, a man of high society, was duped. We ask the court to annul this marriage on the grounds of fraud, leaving her with absolutely nothing." Richard smirked. This was the kill shot. Annulment meant she wasn't even a divorcee. She was a stranger. The judge looked at Sandra. Mrs. Sterling, your counsel may respond. Arthur Pendleton stood up. He didn't look at his notes. He looked directly at Richard. My client. Arthur began, his voice suddenly dropping its shakiness, resonating with a deep baritone power. Is indeed a very private person. She values discretion above all else. That is why she did not attend the loud, drunken galas Mr. Sterling enjoys. That is why she did not travel to Milan to watch Mr. Sterling cheat on her with his secretary in 2021, or with Miss Vane in 2023. Objection, Stone shouted. Withdrawn, Arthur said calmly. As for her history, Mr. Stone is correct. Sandra Sterling does not have a birth certificate in the United States, and she did not graduate from the University of Zurich as a common student. Arthur walked to the center of the room. You see, Mr. Sterling was so obsessed with his own voice, he never really listened to his wife. He never asked about her childhood in the mountains of Eldoria. He never asked why she spoke 4 languages fluently. He simply assumed that because she was quiet, she was weak. Because she didn't wear diamonds, she was poor. Arthur turned to the bailiff. Your Honor, the defense calls its first witness, but we request a brief recess to clear security protocols. Security protocols, the judge frowned. For a witness. Yes, Your Honor, Arthur said. The witness is under diplomatic protection. Richard frowned. Diplomatic protection? What kind of game was this? Was she bringing in some sketchy immigrant relative to cry about poverty? The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, but it wasn't a witness who walked in. 2 men in dark suits with earpieces entered first, scanning the room. They were followed by a man in a military uniform, not American. It was a slate-gray uniform with gold epaulets and a red sash. He carried a heavy, velvet-covered box. Richard squinted. The uniform? It looked vaguely familiar. He had seen it in magazines, usually associated with old European money. The man in the uniform walked straight to the defense table. He ignored everyone else. He stopped in front of Sandra, clicked his heels together with a sharp snap, and bowed deep at the waist. Your Highness, the man said, his voice thick with a Germanic accent. The delegation has arrived. The entire courtroom gasped. Even the stenographer stopped typing. Richard froze. Highness Sandra Sterling. The woman in the oversized cardigan slowly stood up. She reached up and pulled the messy bun out of her hair, letting the long chestnut locks cascade down her back. She took off her glasses and set them on the table. She turned to Richard. The look of submission was gone. In its place was a look of absolute terrifying authority. Thank you, Colonel, Sandra said, her voice clear and commanding. You may present the seal to the judge. Richard felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. He looked at Jessica. She looked confused. Richard, she whispered, why is that guy bowing to her? Is this a prank? But Richard knew. Deep in his gut, the sickness was starting to rise. He had called her a peasant. He had called her a nobody. He watched as the colonel approached the bench and placed the velvet box before Judge Calvetti. The judge opened it. Inside lay a document sealed with thick red wax and a golden crest. A crest depicting a double-headed eagle and a crown. Your Honor, Arthur Pendleton said, smiling for the first time. I would like to introduce the court to the true identity of the defendant. You know her as Sandra Sterling, but her legal name, recognized by the International Court of Justice and the Sovereign Principality of Eldoria, is Her Royal Highness Princess Sandra Sophia Valois, third in line to the throne and the sole heiress to the Valois estate. Richard's mouth fell open. "And," Arthur added, turning to look at a pale, trembling Richard, "she is currently the owner of the bank that holds the mortgage on Mr. Sterling's firm." The silence in the courtroom was shattered by the sound of Jessica Vane dropping her phone. The silence in courtroom 304 didn't last. It was broken by the sharp, hysterical laugh of Richard Sterling. It was the laugh of a man whose brain had simply refused to process the information it had just been fed. "Princess," Richard sputtered, standing up and pointing a shaking finger at Sandra. "Princess, Your Honor, this is ludicrous. Look at her. She's wearing a cardigan from a thrift store. She counts coupons. This is some kind of elaborate stunt to delay the proceedings. I want her held in contempt." Marcus Stone. Richard's lawyer was smarter. He wasn't laughing. He was staring at the document on the judge's bench with the eyes of a man watching a tsunami approach the shore. He recognized the seal. He knew what the Valois name meant in international banking. It meant old money. The kind of money that didn't shout. It whispered, and governments listened. "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," Judge Calvetti ordered, his voice stern. He was studying the documents with intense fascination. "Mr. Stone, I have reviewed the credentials provided by the Colonel here. They appear legitimate. The Department of State has validated the seal." The judge looked over his glasses at Sandra. "Mrs. Sterling, or should I say, Your Highness, why the deception? Why enter a marriage under a false pretense of poverty?" Sandra remained standing. She didn't look at the judge. She looked at Richard. Her eyes were filled with a sadness that was rapidly hardening into ice. "Because, Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying to the back of the room, where reporters were now trying to shove their way in, tipped off by the arrival of the Royal Guard. "I grew up in a world where everyone wanted something from me. My title, my influence, my family's wealth. I wanted to be loved for me. Just Sandra, not the princess." She took a step toward the plaintiff's table. "When I met Richard 6 years ago, I thought I had found it. I thought he loved the quiet girl in the jazz club. I hid my background to protect our love. I lived on his budget. I cleaned his apartment. I cooked his meals. I supported him while he climbed the corporate ladder, comforting him when he lost deals, celebrating when he won. I played the role of the supportive, humble wife because I thought we were building a life together." She paused, her gaze shifting to Jessica Vane, who was shrinking into her seat. "I didn't know that while I was saving money by clipping coupons so we could afford his image, he was spending thousands on dinners with women like her." Richard's face was red veins bulging in his neck. His greed, however, was faster than his shame. His mind raced. "Wait, if she's a princess, if she's worth billions..." A sick, greedy grin spread across Richard's face. He grabbed his lawyer's arm. "Marcus," he whispered frantically, "forget the 10 grand, forget the divorce, or... No, wait. If we divorce, I get half. New York is an equitable distribution state. If she hid assets, I'm entitled to them." Richard stood up, straightening his tie, his arrogance returning in a flood. "Well," he boomed, "this is certainly a surprise. But the law is the law, Your Honor. We are married. Her assets are marital property. If my wife is indeed royalty, then I am a prince by marriage. And if we are to divorce, I am entitled to 50% of the Valois estate to maintain the lifestyle to which I should have been accustomed had she not defrauded me." "I want half," Richard shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "I want half of the bank, half of the estate, half of everything." Jessica Vane's eyes lit up in the back row. Half a kingdom. She suddenly sat up straighter, fixing her hair. Sandra's lawyer, Arthur Pendleton, let out a dry, dusty chuckle. It sounded like leaves scraping on a sidewalk. "Mr. Stone," Arthur said, opening his battered briefcase again, "I believe your client is forgetting something very important, a document he insisted upon with great aggression 6 years ago." Richard froze. Arthur pulled out a single, yellowing piece of paper. "Exhibit B, Your Honor. The prenuptial agreement." Richard's blood ran cold. He remembered. 6 years ago, Richard had just made his first million. Sandra was seemingly a broke waitress. Richard had been terrified, paranoid, that she was after his meager savings. He had hired the nastiest lawyer he could find to draft a protection agreement. Arthur began to read, his voice dripping with irony. Clause 14, Section B, drafted by Mr. Sterling's own legal team. In the event of a dissolution of marriage, regardless of the cause, each party shall retain sole ownership of all assets, titles, inheritances, and properties brought into the marriage or acquired independently during the marriage. There shall be no division of assets. What is his remains his. What is hers remains hers. Arthur lowered the paper. "Mr. Sterling was very specific, Your Honor. He told my client, and I quote from the deposition transcript, 'I don't want you touching a penny of my hard-earned money when I dump you.'" The courtroom erupted in murmurs. "He locked himself out," Arthur said, smiling. "This prenuptial agreement is ironclad. Mr. Sterling insisted on it to protect his millions. In doing so, he protected Her Highness's billions." "No," Richard gasped. "No. That was for my protection. It wasn't meant for... I didn't know. Ignorance of your wife's net worth is not a legal defense for voiding a contract you forced her to sign," Judge Calvetti said, fighting back a smile. "The prenuptial agreement stands. Mr. Sterling, you get nothing from the Valois estate. Not a dime." Richard slumped into his chair, looking like he had been punched in the gut. But Sandra wasn't done. "Actually, Your Honor," Sandra said, stepping forward, "we are not done with the financials. While Richard gets nothing of mine, we need to discuss what he owes me." Richard looked up confused. "Owe you? I paid for everything. I paid the rent. I paid the bills." "Did you?" Sandra asked softly. "Or did you pay them with money you borrowed?" Arthur Pendleton pulled out a thick stack of files. "Part 4 of our submission, Your Honor. The matter of Sterling and Finch and the loans from the Eldoria Royal Bank." The air in the courtroom had shifted from tense to predatory. Richard Sterling was no longer the hunter. He was the wounded gazelle, and the lions were circling. "What are you talking about?" Richard snapped, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "My firm is solid. We have liquidity." "Mr. Sterling," Arthur said, "your firm, Sterling and Finch, operates largely on leveraged buyouts. You borrow massive amounts of money to buy companies, strip them for parts, and sell them. It's a risky business model. And 3 years ago, when your hostile takeover of the Tech Core group failed, you needed a massive influx of cash to stop your company from collapsing." Richard went pale. That was a secret. Only his CFO knew about the Tech Core disaster. "You took out a private loan," Arthur continued. "A loan of $25 million. You secured it through a shell corporation in Zurich to hide it from your board of directors. The lender was Vanguard Capital." "So what?" Richard said, sweating profusely. "It's a standard business loan. I'm servicing the debt." "Vanguard Capital," Sandra cut in, her voice sharp, "is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Valois Royal Estate. I am the lender, Richard." Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. And, Sandra continued, walking closer to him, you are not servicing the debt. You missed the last 3 payments because you were too busy buying a penthouse for Ms. Vane. Sandra turned her gaze to the second row. Jessica Vane saw the look and physically recoiled. Let's talk about that penthouse, Sandra said. Apartment 4B at the Obsidian Tower. $5 million. Paid for by Jupiter Holdings. But Jupiter Holdings has no income. The money was siphoned from the Sterling and Finch operating accounts that are collateral for the loan you owe me. That's embezzlement, Judge Calvetti noted, his eyebrows raising. And fraud. Exactly, Your Honor, Arthur said. Since the funds used to purchase the apartment were stolen from the collateral of the loan, the apartment is technically the property of the bank, which means it is the property of Her Highness. Sandra looked at Jessica. Ms. Vane, I understand you have been redecorating. I hope you haven't unpacked everything. Jessica stood up, her face patchy with anger and fear. You can't kick me out. It's my apartment. Richard put it in my name. He put it in the name of a shell company, Arthur corrected her. A company that is now being seized for asset forfeiture. The eviction notice was filed this morning. The locks are being changed as we speak. Richard, Jessica screamed, turning on him. Do something. My clothes are in there, my jewelry. Richard was hyperventilating. Sandra, please, he stammered. Let's be reasonable. We can work this out. I didn't know. If I had known who you were. If you had known, Sandra interrupted, you would have loved me for my money, which is even worse than hating me for being poor. She turned back to the judge. Your Honor, Richard Sterling is in breach of contract on a $25 million loan. Under the terms of the agreement, which, ironically, he signed without reading the fine print because he was too busy rushing to a business dinner with Ms. Vane, the lender has the right to immediate repayment in full upon any evidence of embezzlement. Sandra placed a hand on the table. I am calling the loan Richard. I want the $25 million. Today. I don't have it, Richard shrieked. I don't have $25 million in cash. Everything is tied up in stocks. If I sell now, the market will see it. The stock will tank. I'll lose everything. Then you will lose everything, Sandra said coldly. Just like you planned for me to lose everything. You wanted me on the street with $10,000. I am simply returning the energy you gave me. This is vindictive, Marcus Stone shouted, trying to find a legal foothold. This is a personal vendetta masquerading as a business transaction. It is justice, Judge Calvetti said. If your client embezzled funds to buy a mistress an apartment while defaulting on a loan, the lender has every right to seize assets. The court grants the motion for the immediate freezing of Mr. Sterling's personal and business accounts. The bang of the gavel sounded like a gunshot. Assets frozen, the judge declared. Mr. Sterling, I suggest you find a way to pay your wife, or you will be facing criminal charges for the embezzlement. Richard slumped forward, putting his head in his hands. His tailored suit suddenly looked like a costume. He was ruined. But the nightmare wasn't over. From the back of the courtroom, the heavy doors opened again. This time it wasn't royalty. It was the press. They had swarmed past security. Flashes went off blinding in the dim courtroom, and amidst the chaos, Jessica Vane made her move. She realized the ship was sinking, and she wasn't going to drown with the captain. She scrambled over the bench, rushing toward the aisle to escape the cameras. But as she passed Richard, she paused. "You loser!" she screamed at him, her voice shrill enough to break glass. "You said you were rich. You said you were the king of New York. You're just a broke fraud." "Jessica, wait!" Richard reached out for her. She slapped his hand away. "Don't touch me. I'm done. I'm going to the press. I'm going to tell them you tricked me too. I'm a victim." She turned to run, but she tripped on the hem of her tight dress, sprawling onto the courtroom floor right in front of Sandra's sensible flat shoes. Sandra looked down at the woman who had tormented her with text messages and photos for the last year. She didn't sneer. She didn't laugh. She simply stepped around her like one steps around a puddle of dirty water. "Your Honor," Sandra said, her voice cutting through the noise, "I have one more request regarding the custody. Not of children, as we have none, but of the dog." Richard's head snapped up. "Buster." "You can't take Buster. He's my dog." "Buster," Sandra said, "is a golden retriever who spends 12 hours a day in a crate because you are at work or with your mistress. You kick him when he barks. You forget to feed him." She signaled to the colonel. "My security team has already retrieved Buster from the apartment. He is currently on a private jet to Eldoria, where he will have 10 acres of royal gardens to run in." "You stole my dog," Richard roared, finally finding his anger again. He lunged toward her. Instantly, the 2 royal guards in the suits moved. It was a blur of motion. Before Richard could get within 3 feet of Sandra, he was face down on the parquet floor, his arm twisted behind his back, a knee pressed into his spine. "Assault on a royal dignitary," the colonel stated calmly. "That is a felony, Mr. Sterling, and since it involves a foreign diplomat, it is now a federal offense." Richard groaned, his face pressed against the floor, staring sideways at Jessica Vane's high heels as she fled the room. Sandra looked down at him. "I loved you, Richard," she whispered. "I really did. But you killed that love day by day, lie by lie. You wanted a trophy. You lost the only real prize you ever had." She turned to her lawyer. "Mr. Pendleton, let's finish this." But as the guards hauled Richard up, a man in a frantic suit burst through the doors. It was the CFO of Sterling and Finch. "Mr. Sterling," the CFO yelled, ignoring the judge and the guards. "Mr. Sterling." "The news." "It's out. The news that the Royal Bank has called the loan. The stock is free falling. The board is holding an emergency meeting. They're voting to oust you as CEO." Richard's eyes went wide. It wasn't just the money. It was his identity, his job, his title. "No," he whimpered. Sandra paused at the door. She looked back. "Oh," she said. "I forgot to mention. I bought the majority shares of Sterling and Finch this morning. I'm the new chairman of the board. And Richard, you're fired." The transition from the plush temperature-controlled environment of the courtroom to the chaos of the sidewalk outside the Manhattan Supreme Court was jarring. Richard Sterling did not walk out. He was marched out. The federal agents who had taken custody of him weren't the polite corporate security types he was used to bullying at his office building. These were agents from the Southern District of New York, SDNY, the most aggressive prosecutor's office in the country, known for eating Wall Street wolves for breakfast. "Hands on your head. Watch your head," an agent barked as they shoved Richard toward a waiting unmarked SUV. The flashing lights of the press cameras were blinding. It was a media circus. The story had leaked instantly. "Billionaire princess takes down Wall Street cheat." It was the kind of headline that sold newspapers, and the paparazzi were in a frenzy. Richard," a reporter from the New York Post screamed, thrusting a microphone at the window as the car door slammed. "Is it true you stole money to buy a mistress a condo? How does it feel to be fired by your own wife?" Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. He was hyperventilating in the back of the car, his wrists handcuffed so tightly the metal bit into his skin. He looked down at his platinum Rolex Daytona. "I'll take that," the agent sitting next to him said, holding out a hand. "What? No," Richard stammered. "This is personal property. The prenup. The prenup covers civil assets in a divorce," the agent said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "This is a federal seizure for a criminal investigation into wire fraud and embezzlement. Proceeds of crime. Hand it over." Richard watched, trembling, as the agent unclasped the watch, the symbol of his status, the first big purchase he'd made when he became a VP, and dropped it into a plastic evidence bag. It landed with a hollow thud. The ride to the Metropolitan Correctional Center, MCC, in Lower Manhattan was silent. This wasn't the country club, prison he had joked about with his finance buddies. This was where they held terrorists and drug lords. The Guantanamo of New York. As Richard was processed, stripped of his Brioni suit and forced into a stiff, bright orange jumpsuit that smelled faintly of mildew and industrial detergent, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He wasn't Richard Sterling, the master of the universe, anymore. He was inmate number 74922. Back in the city, the dismantling of his life was happening at lightning speed. Sandra stood in the penthouse of the Obsidian Tower, the apartment Richard had bought for Jessica. It was a gaudy display of new money, white leather sofas, gold leaf mirrors, and aggressive modern art. "Your Highness," the colonel said, walking in with a tablet. "We have secured the premises. Ms. Vane has fled, but she left most of her belongings." "Burn the furniture," Sandra said, her voice calm. "Donate the clothes to a women's shelter, but remove the labels first. I don't want anyone knowing where they came from." "And the bank accounts?" the colonel asked. "Frozen," Sandra confirmed. She walked to the window, looking out over the city that Richard thought he owned. He thought he was playing chess colonel, but he didn't realize he was playing on a board I bought 10 years ago. Meanwhile, Jessica Vane was discovering that loyalty in the world of influencers is thinner than smartphone glass. She was sitting in a Starbucks 3 blocks away, furiously trying to delete photos from her Instagram. Every photo of her and Richard on a yacht. Every photo of the diamond necklace he bought her with stolen funds. Every smug caption about manifesting abundance. But the internet is forever. Her comments section was already a war zone. Thousands of comments poured in. "Home wrecker. You stole from a princess. # Team Sandra. Give the money back." Jessica's phone buzzed. It was her agent, Mike. "Mike," she cried, relief flooding her voice. "Thank God. You have to help me spin this. We can say I was a victim, too. We can say he lied to me about being separated. We can do an exclusive interview with Oprah." "Jessica," Mike said, his voice cold, "the agency is dropping you. Effective immediately." "What?" Jessica shrieked, causing patrons in the coffee shop to turn and stare. "You can't drop me. I have a contract, the tea detox deal." "The tea company just called," Mike said. "They're suing you for breach of morality clause. And Jessica, I'd get a lawyer if I were you. The feds just called my office looking for you. They want to know about the jewelry Richard gave you. If you accepted gifts knowing they were bought with stolen money, that's receipt of stolen goods. That's jail time." The line went dead. Jessica stared at the phone. Her hands started to shake. She looked out the window and saw a police cruiser slowly rolling down the street. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her chest. She wasn't thinking about Richard anymore. She was thinking about survival. She opened her contacts and scrolled until she found a number she had saved from a business card Richard had once foolishly left on the table. Marcus Stone, attorney at law. She dialed. "Mr. Stone," she whispered when he answered. "It's Jessica. I have information on Richard. I have emails. I have texts where he talks about the offshore accounts. I'll give you everything. Just keep me out of jail." On the other end of the line, Marcus Stone, who had just been fired by Richard because Richard's checks had bounced, smiled a predatory smile. "Keep talking, Ms. Vane," Stone said. "I'm listening." 3 months later. The courtroom was the same, but the dynamic had completely inverted. This was not a divorce hearing in family court. This was the Federal District Court, presided over by Judge Sylvia Thorne, a woman known in the legal circuit as the Hammer. Richard sat at the defense table. He had lost 20 pounds. His hair, usually dyed and styled, was graying at the roots and thinning. The orange jumpsuit hung off his frame. There was no high-powered legal team around him. Marcus Stone had recused himself due to non-payment of retainers, and Richard was now represented by a public defender, a tired-looking man named Gary, who was juggling 40 other cases. The gallery was packed, but Richard didn't look at the crowd. He kept his eyes on the table. He couldn't bear to look at the front row. In the front row sat Sandra. She looked breathtaking. She wasn't wearing the grey cardigan anymore. She was wearing a deep navy bespoke suit pearls that were likely worth more than Richard's entire former company, and she held herself with the poise of a queen. Beside her sat Buster the golden retriever, wearing a service dog vest, looking healthier and happier than he had in years. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Thorne said, looking down from the bench, "you have pleaded guilty to 3 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of embezzlement, and 1 count of tax evasion. The evidence against you is overwhelming." I was under pressure," Richard rasped into the microphone. "I intended to pay it back. It was just a liquidity crunch." "You stole $25 million from a bank owned by your wife to buy luxury goods for a mistress," Judge Thorne said, her voice dripping with disdain. "That is not a liquidity crunch. That is greed." "Your Honor," the prosecutor stood up. "The government would like to call 1 witness for the sentencing phase, to speak to the defendant's character and intent." "Proceed," the judge said. "The government calls Ms. Jessica Vane." Richard's head snapped up. "Jessica." The side door opened. Jessica walked in. She wasn't wearing her usual flashy clothes. She wore a modest beige dress and flats. She didn't look at Richard. She walked straight to the witness stand. "Ms. Vane," the prosecutor asked, "can you tell the court what Mr. Sterling told you regarding the funds used to purchase the apartment?" Jessica took a deep breath. She had cut a deal. Full immunity in exchange for testimony. She was going to bury him to save herself. "He told me." Jessica's voice wavered, then strengthened. "He told me that his wife was stupid. He said she was a leech and that he was going to drain every account before he divorced her so she would starve. He laughed about it. He said he was moving the money to the Caymans so the courts couldn't find it. He explicitly said, 'I'm going to leave her in the gutter.'" A gasp went through the courtroom. Richard stood up, his chains rattling. "Liar. You told me to do it. You said you wouldn't be with me unless I bought the penthouse. Order." Judge Thorne banged the gavel. "Sit down, Mr. Sterling." "She's lying," Richard screamed, tears streaming down his face. "I did it for you. I loved you." Jessica looked at him then, cold and detached. "And you didn't love me, Richard. You loved that I made you feel like a big man. But you're small. You're so small." Richard collapsed back into his chair, sobbing. It was a pathetic sound. The master of the universe was gone. All that was left was a lonely, broken man. The judge adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Sterling, your actions were calculated, cruel, and malicious. You attempted to defraud not just a bank, but the person who should have been your partner in life. You attempted to weaponize the legal system to abuse your wife financially." She picked up a paper. "However, the victim, Her Highness Princess Sandra, has submitted a statement." The judge looked at Sandra. Sandra nodded slightly. "She has requested that the court show mercy," the judge said, surprising everyone. "She states that she does not wish for you to rot in prison for the rest of your life, as she believes in the potential for redemption." Richard looked up, hope flaring in his eyes. "Mercy, she still loves me, therefore," the judge continued, "I am sentencing you to 10 years in federal prison. However, per the victim's request, I am recommending you be placed in the minimum security facility in upstate New York, on one condition." "Condition," Richard whispered. "The facility runs a mandatory vocational program," the judge said, a small smile playing on her lips. "Her Highness has endowed a new wing of the prison specifically for this program. It is a laundry service. You will spend your 10 years washing, drying, and folding the uniforms of other inmates. You will learn the value of the domestic labor you so despised your wife for doing." The gavel banged. 10 years. Remanded to custody immediately. Richard was hauled to his feet. As he was dragged away, he looked back at Sandra one last time. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She just looked relieved. She raised her hand and gave a small, final wave. "Bye, Richard," she mouthed. Then she turned to the colonel. "Come on. We have a board meeting at Sterling and Finch. I'm renaming the company today." "What will you call it, Your Highness?" the colonel asked, as they walked out, the press parting like the Red Sea for them. Sandra smiled, putting on her dark sunglasses. "Phoenix Capital," she said, "because we rise from the ashes." 1 year later. The humidity in the laundry block of the Otisville Federal Correctional Institution was suffocating. It smelled of bleach, stale sweat, and regret. Inmate 74922 wiped his brow with the back of his arm. Richard Sterling, once a man who wouldn't touch a door handle without hand sanitizer, was elbow deep in a cart of wet grey prison uniforms. "Hey, Sterling," a guard shouted from the catwalk. "Pick up the pace. Block B needs those jumpsuits folded by noon, or you're missing lunch." "Yes, sir," Richard mumbled, grabbing a heavy wet shirt. His hands, once manicured and soft, were now red-chapped and covered in calluses. He moved mechanically. Shake, fold, stack. Shake, fold, stack. It was the same routine day in and day out. The irony was a bitter pill he had to swallow every single morning. He had mocked Sandra for doing the laundry. He had told her it was menial work beneath him. Now it was his entire existence. During his 15-minute break, Richard sat on a plastic crate in the common area, sipping lukewarm water from a paper cup. A small television was mounted in the corner, usually playing sports reruns. But today, the channel was set to a national business news network. Richard wasn't paying attention until he heard the voice. "Remarkable turnaround, from a silent partner to the most influential CEO in New York City. Please welcome the businesswoman of the year, Sandra Valois." Richard's head snapped up. There she was, on the screen in high definition. She looked radiant. She was wearing a cream-colored suit that exuded power and grace. Her hair was loose, shining under the studio lights. She didn't look like the mousy woman he had divorced. She looked like a queen. The interviewer leaned in. "Your Highness, your company Phoenix Capital has just acquired the very firm that once tried to ruin you. You turned a failing predatory lending company into a massive non-profit that helps low-income families buy their first homes." "Why?" Sandra smiled. It was a genuine smile, one Richard realized he hadn't seen in years, because he had been the one extinguishing it. "Because," Sandra said, softly looking directly into the camera, "I know what it feels like to be underestimated. I know what it feels like to have someone look at you and assume you are worth nothing. I wanted to build an empire that values character over currency. Money is easy to get. Loyalty. That is the true luxury." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. "And," the interviewer added, "we have to ask, there are rumors of a new romance, a certain duke from Spain." Sandra laughed, a bright, happy sound. "I am very happy. I have found a partner who loves me for who I am, not for the title I hold. He doesn't care about the crown. He just likes walking the dog with me." The camera cut to a clip of Sandra walking Buster Richards' old dog in a beautiful park, accompanied by a tall, handsome man who was looking at Sandra like she was the only woman in the world. Richard stared at the screen, his eyes burning. He had that. He had all of that. He had a woman who loved him when he was nobody. He had a loyal dog. He had a comfortable life. But he had thrown it all away for a shallow influencer and a penthouse he couldn't afford. Speaking of the influencer, the news ticker at the bottom of the screen scrolled past a minor headline. "Former social media star Jessica Vane files for bankruptcy. Caught shoplifting at Walmart." "Hey, Sterling," another inmate, a large man named Miller, nudged him. "Ain't that your ex-wife?" Richard looked at the screen, then down at his chapped hands and his orange jumpsuit. "No," Richard whispered, his voice cracking. "She's not my ex-wife. She's a stranger. I never really knew her at all." "Tough break, buddy." Miller laughed, slapping him on the back. "Now come on. The underwear ain't gonna fold itself." Richard stood up. He took one last look at Sandra's smiling face on the screen, then turned his back on the life he could have had and walked back into the steam. Wow. Talk about a reality check, right? Richard thought he was playing chess, but he didn't even realize he was just a pawn in a game Sandra owned from the start. It's a brutal lesson, but a necessary one. When you marry for money, you'll pay for it every single day. And when you underestimate the quiet ones, you usually end up making the loudest mistakes. I want to know what you would have done if you were Sandra. Would you have shown Richard mercy and sent him to the laundry room? Or would you have let him rot in maximum security? Let me know your verdict in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of karma and justice, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow so I can bring you more stories like this. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss the next drama. Thanks for watching. Stay loyal and I'll see you in the next video.